Actually, what I'd like to do today is go back to the Hebrews passage to talk about faith. The title of today's sermon is Tested Faith. And as I was preparing and reading through the scriptures, this, for some reason, got my attention. And particularly, I just want to focus on verses 17 through 19 of chapter 11. So we won't go through verse by verse all the way through chapter 11, but just repeating 17 through 19 of Hebrews 11, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac your offspring shall be named.' He considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, figuratively speaking, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." So, when he was tested, that was the phrase that I just got stuck on. When Abraham was tested. Abraham was tested, we know, because it tells us here, when God commanded him to offer up his son Isaac as a sacrifice, as a burnt offering. That means he would have to take him, he would have to slit his throat, and put him on an altar and set the wood on fire. You know, although Abraham had another son, right, his name was Ishmael, Ishmael was the product of, let me rewind. Although Abraham had another son named Ishmael, Isaac was the product of Abraham and Sarah's union. Then they were known as Abram and Sarai. But Ishmael was the product of Abram and Sarai taking matters into their own hands. The result of that effort was strife between Sarah and Hagar, and eventually Hagar and Ishmael were sent away. And we know that account from Genesis. Isaac was the offspring of Abraham and Sarah, and it was Isaac who was the promised son. So we know that God was being specific when he says, "Take your son, your only son." Now, this test of Abraham's faith, it didn't require Abraham to grab him and throw him on the altar right away and get it done. Right? This was going to be a slower, drawn-out process. And if you read the account in Genesis 22, it tells you that it took them 3 days to get to the spot. Because on the third day, Abraham saw the mountain that God had told him to go to. So it took him 3 days just to get to the spot that God had selected for the sacrifice. And, you know, we can only imagine what was going through Abraham's mind as he's doing this. Now, he's obeying the Lord, right? He did what he was told. He got everything together. He got 2 young men to accompany them, and he went on this journey, but he's got to be struggling with this. He's got to be struggling. And by this, we know, but this we know, that faith, because this wasn't, although Abraham's faith is being tested, Abraham, or I should say faith, is already at work in Abraham. And we see this in various places in Genesis. We know that faith was already in operation in Abraham's life. In Genesis 15, it tells us that when God promised Abraham a son, Abraham believed the Lord, and it says the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. So we see faith in operation there in Abraham. But even before that, Hebrews tells us that it was by faith that Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. So even then, you see faith in operation in Abraham's life. And it was by faith that Abraham went to live in the land of promise, living in tents as a stranger. So, it takes faith to leave your home, leave the people you know and love, and go to a place that is undisclosed, a place that I will show you. So we see that faith is in operation in Abraham's life even before this test. And then we see the faith of Abraham in operation again in his instructions to the 2 young men that accompanied them to Mount Moriah for this sacrifice. Because Abraham said to them, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So Abraham knew that he would somehow return with Isaac. Didn't know exactly how, but he knew that he would return with Isaac, as today's text tells us, that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And we see Abraham's faith in action once again when Isaac asks him, Father, we have the coals and the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham, he doesn't hem, he doesn't haw, he doesn't say, well, I didn't want to tell you this until we got here. I don't know how I would handle the situation, but I might get a little creative with it. But Abraham simply answered, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So this is steadfast faith. It's being tested to its limit, but this is steadfast faith. And just a comment there, in our own walk, what God requires, God provides. He requires payment for our sins, doesn't he? And it was provided through the cross. Those who don't put their faith in Christ and don't accept the work of Christ on the cross will have to pay for their own sins for all eternity. God requires righteousness as well. He requires perfect obedience. And he provided that through Christ as well. In living this perfect life on earth, obeying the law on all points, and taking the punishment and the wrath of God for our sins on the cross, our sins are imputed to Christ, but his righteousness is imputed to us, which is how we can stand before God. So what God requires, he provides. And Genesis 22 goes on to say that, I think Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. Do we know that song, Jehovah Jireh? Jehovah Jireh, my provider, his strength is, his grace is sufficient for me. Do we know that? Well, maybe one day we'll do that. But Abraham was not always this steadfast in faith. For Abraham, this was a process. Like us, it's a process. We grow. In Genesis 12, when Abraham went to live in Egypt, he was still known as Abram at that time, he had his wife Sarai tell Pharaoh, tell him you're my sister, because these people will kill me, because you're very beautiful, and they'll take you for themselves and they'll kill me. So he did it to protect his own life. And then in Genesis 16, he listened to the voice of his wife instead of assuring her with God's promise. When she said, take my maid Hagar and go into her, and perhaps, maybe, see, she wasn't even sure, perhaps God will give me children through her. And the result was Isaac and years of strife. And then in Genesis 20, when he went to live in Gerar, Abraham, now his name has been changed, he tells King Abimelech that Sarah is his sister, again, to protect his own life. Well, at least he's doing his own dirty work. The first time he got his wife to do it for him, tell him this time around, he says, well, she's my sister. But in these cases, Abraham let his circumstances dictate his actions. Despite having the promises of God, those promises were to make him a great nation and bless all the families of the earth. In the case of Pharaoh and Abimelech, it was self-preservation that was motivating him. And in the case of Hagar, he wanted to please his wife. He could have reassured her. Says, it's okay. Because she says, I don't have children. God hasn't given me children. He could have easily have told her, God has promised that we will have children. That our descendants will be as numerous as the sand of the seashore and the stars in the sky. But nope, Abraham said, okay. And the rest is history. So by the time we get to the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham's faith is more steadfast. Because God gives him the command, and Abraham doesn't hesitate. He preps for the journey. It's a 3-day journey. He prepares for the journey. He does not try to offer a substitute. He doesn't try to reason with God. as he did when he interceded for Sodom. You sure you want me to sacrifice Isaac? What has the boy done? No. He didn't say a word. And he didn't try to flee as Jonah did. We all remember Jonah, when Jonah was given a word of judgment for the city of Nineveh, which was that way. Jonah booked a cruise and went that way. And the rest is history. You can read about that as well. But out of this lesson, out of this episode with Abraham, I just wanted to share 3 things to remember when our faith is tested. And it will be tested. And the first thing is this: our faith will be tested. The testing of our faith doesn't just happen to other people or a select few. In James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, James writes, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." James does not say if your faith is tested or if you meet trials. He says when. So our faith will be tested. And the reference to trials here is plural, which tells us there will be more than one trial. There will be more than one type of trial. They will come in different forms because he says various types of trials. And just so that we understand what a trial is, Strong's definition says it's a putting to proof by experiment of good, experience of evil, solicitation, discipline, or provocation. By implication, adversity. So we can be tested by good circumstances. God has blessed me with all this money. He must want me to be rich. He may want you to pass it on to someone else. Or it could be a bad circumstance. God has taken all my money. He must want me to be poor. No, maybe he wants you to depend on him. But you get the picture. So James tells us to count it all joy when these things happen. And James also gives us the why our faith is tested. He goes on to say, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So that's the why of the test. We're tested, regardless of what that test might be. We're being tested so that steadfastness would be produced in us, that we would be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And there are eternal implications where James goes on to say, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Remember back in, I think it's Matthew 24, Jesus said, "It's he who endures until the end that will be saved." It's not a conditional statement, meaning if you falter before Jesus comes back, you're going to hell. No, it's telling us that God is working perseverance into us. By the testing of our faith, he is teaching us and training us how to endure, so that we will endure to the end, so that we will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. This is why we can count it all joy when we are tested, if we understand why we're being tested and what God is doing in our lives. The second thing to remember when our faith is tested is that we will be tested in areas that are nearest and dearest to our heart. All right? What was the command to Abraham? "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love." God was very specific about who he was talking about because Abraham did have another son. There was no room for misunderstanding. There was no room for misinterpretation. Had God had just said, "Well, take your son and sacrifice him," Abraham may have thought for a minute and said, "Well, go find Ishmael. We'll sacrifice him because I really love Isaac." He would have tried for the classic win-win. God gets what he wants, and I get to keep the son I really love. But nope, he said, "Take your only son Isaac, whom you love." So Abraham, he reminded Abraham of the place that Isaac occupied in his heart. So God is speaking to Abraham's heart also. Take your son, whom you love. Who is our Isaac? Who would God ask us to sacrifice. Or it could be a what? What is God asking us to put on the altar and burn up to make sure that we're following him with a whole heart? Remember also Job's testing. With the exception of Job's wife, God took everything from Job, right? He took his possessions. He took his livestock. He took his children. He didn't take his wife, which makes me wonder about their relationship, but no. I think in sparing Job's wife, God was leaving in place the means of restoration. Because remember, Job had more children after that. So God always provides. He always provides when he tests. So the third thing we ought to remember when our faith is tested is that we must consider not what we must do, but what God has done and what God can do. Remember, today's text tells us that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead. So we get a picture into Abraham's thinking from the writer of Hebrews. But when our faith is tested, what's the first reaction we have? What am I going to do? Whatever it is, you lose your job, we lose our home in a fire, somebody takes something of ours. What am I going to do? But that's not the question we ask. The question we should be asking and reminding ourselves of is, what is God doing? And we can remind ourselves of the things God has done and the things that we know that God can do. At this point of the test, Abraham had a few things that he could hang his hat on because he had been walking with God. Abraham had the promises and the covenant of God because God had already met him a few times and made the promise. Abraham had the covenant of circumcision, which gave him physical evidence and a daily reminder of God's promise. And Abraham had the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise in Isaac. Remember, he said, your descendants will be as numerous as the sand of the seashore. Think of Isaac as the down payment on that promise. And Abraham could look ahead. So, if we know what God can do, if we study his works, listen to this. I'm reading from Psalm 111, starting in verse 2. It says, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Full of splendor and majesty is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has caused his wondrous works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and merciful. He provides food for those who fear him. He remembers his covenant forever. He has shown his people the power of his works in giving them the inheritance of the nations. The works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. They are established forever and ever to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. He sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever. So it's as we study the works of God, his covenant, his precepts, we see his character in the things that he has done, his faithfulness, his love, but also his holiness and his wrath. It's as we do these things that we can obey the Lord when our faith is tested, because we know who's testing us and we know why he is testing us. We said earlier, he's producing endurance in us. He's producing steadfastness and perseverance in us. The Psalms are full of David's words during his times of testing. Psalm 3, we won't turn there, but I encourage you to read that. Psalm 3 is just one example. David wrote that psalm when his son Absalom temporarily took the throne from him. Remember, David was driven out of Jerusalem and they fled. And Absalom did some pretty nasty things while he was king. So Psalm 3 was written in the midst of that. But there are other Psalms also, 18, 34, 52, 54. Sound like I'm reading Powerball numbers. 56, 59, 57, and 63. These are all Psalms that David wrote in times of adversity and in times of testing. And each and every time he reminds himself, he preaches to himself. He reminds himself of who God is, what God has done, and what God can do. And in the end, he finishes with praising the Lord. So Abraham had walked with God for about 3 decades. He was, 75 when he left Haran with his family, and he was over 100 years old after Isaac. He had Isaac at 100, and now Isaac is a young man. So Abraham had walked with God for about 3 decades when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. But through his fellowship with God, he had grown in his faith. Now, let's remember, Abraham was over 100 years old when this happened. So don't think because we're of a certain age that we'll get a pass on trials. Oh, he's old, his heart is weak, he's got high blood pressure, let's not, no. God will do what he has to do to conform us to the image of Christ. So, let's bring this to a close. If we want to grow in our faith, if we want to remain steadfast when we are tested, we must remain in fellowship with God. Close fellowship with God. That's him now. So... It's times like that when the phone disappears. Now you can't find it in your bag. Anyway, so if we want to remain steadfast in times of testing, we have to remain in fellowship with God. We have to recall and declare his deeds. We have to recall and declare his promises. You know, Psalm 96 and verse 2 says, "Tell of his salvation from day to day." So it's not just when we gather together on Sundays to do this, which is good. You know, we do these things in the assembly, but we also do these things, we remind ourselves of these things as we go through the Word, as we worship privately, as we pray privately. We have to live in the Word. We have to live prayerfully in the Word. We have to live also in fellowship with God's people. That's all part of the package. Jesus calls it abiding in the vine, right? John 15, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." That includes standing firm when tested. We don't want to find ourselves apart from Christ when our faith is tested. When we remember who God is and what he has done and what he has promised, we can and must remind ourselves of these things when we are tested. We can remain steadfast when we are tested. And when we remain steadfast, we can be perfect. We're being made perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. When God gives the difficult command, we can say, "Yes, Lord," without hesitation, without doubt. We can say God will provide what he requires. He's asking something difficult of me, whatever that might be. But he will provide what he requires. So the remainder of Hebrews chapter 11, we won't go through the verses, but the remainder goes on to catalog some of the heroes of the faith. As Debbie read earlier, Isaac, who pronounced future blessings on Jacob and Esau, despite their drama. Right? That was a troubled relationship. Jacob was able to bless the sons of Joseph from his deathbed. Joseph was able to look forward to the Exodus that would not come for another 400 years, as he gave instructions for the disposition of his bones. The parents of Moses were able to hide their baby in defiance of the king's edict. Moses was able to reject his life of privilege, choosing instead to be mistreated with the Israelites, the people of God. The people of Israel were able to cross the Red Sea on dry land, and they were able to bring down the walls of Jericho simply by marching around them. That's a test of faith, right? Go conquer that city, but just march around it. I'll do the rest. Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies into the land, and she lived because of that. So it goes on to tell us of the others who survived, who conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, stopped the mouth of lions. They were also tortured. They suffered mocking and flogging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. That was, I believe, Isaiah the prophet, was sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They were people, Scripture says, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And like Abraham and the other patriarchs, they pleased God through their faith. Though their faith was tested, they were steadfast. So this is the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us. The lesson we can take from them is to lay aside every weight, every sin that clings so closely that we may run with endurance the race that is before us. Let me not paraphrase it, let me just read it. So therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, that we may run with endurance the race that is before us. So we're surrounded by these heroes of the faith, and while we can take encouragement from their examples, we are, however, to look where? We are to look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Depending on your translation, it'll say author and finisher, founder and perfecter. I think you get the idea. Christ is the source of our faith. As the author and the founder of our faith, he is the source of our faith. Remember, faith is not something we worked up. Faith is a gift from God, it says in Ephesians 2. Okay, faith is a gift of God. It's part of the grace that is extended toward us. Christ is the object of our faith. And Christ will bring our faith to perfection when he raises us up on the last day, as he has promised. Not only will he raise us up, he's also going to raise up all the people we just read about in Hebrews 11. All the people who are listed by name. Because it says, apart from us, they will not be made perfect. So all will be raised at once. So the testing of our faith is a reality of the Christian life. We will be tested. I don't know on what level it will happen for us, for each of us, but we will be tested. The testing of our faith is necessary. It's necessary to produce steadfastness in us, that we may be lacking in nothing. But ultimately, the testing of our faith is for the glory of God, as is everything else. As Peter writes in 1 Peter 1:7, that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result, here it is, in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So the faith that is within us now is going to be tested, but it's being tested by fire so that it may appear more precious than gold when Jesus returns, and it will result in praise and glory and honor to God. That's why we're being tested. The benefit to us is that steadfastness is being produced in us, but the ultimate reason for our testing is so that God will be glorified when Christ is revealed at the end of the age. So I end with this. Knowing that God will be glorified in our trials is where we will find our joy in those trials. So may God be glorified in each of us. Amen? Amen. Let's pray.